Hi, my name is Gideon Schreiber. I'm a professor at the Department of Biological Chemistry at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. I'm performing label-free analysis for the last 20 years. I'm interested in transient protein-protein interactions in order to understand their function, their kinetics, and their binding properties. Early on, I used the Biocore 2000 and 3000, and in the last 6 years, I'm using the proton. I'm using it in order to measure binding between proteins and peptides, and between nanoparticles and proteins and peptides. Please listen to the following webinar where I will advise on how to best use the proton in order to measure label-free interactions. The guiding principles will give you strong foundations on the many factors which are important to take care of in order to obtain high-quality interaction data.
This webinar will be different from a normal seminar in the sense that I will talk about methodologies. So it's not really talking about data like usually one is showing in a normal presentation, but this is really a methodological webinar, and the aim is to get practices to obtain high quality interaction data using SPR. So what can we learn and what do we have to consider when we do SPR experiments? And there are multiple factors. And they relate to how the experiment is done and the right conditions to do them in order to get the right rate constants and the right affinities. And one important issue is the issue of Rmax. So RU is basically the refractive unit, and Rmax is the maximum refractive unit in a specific experiment. So Rmax is not something constant of the instrument, but it's really something that relates to the specific experiment. And to optimize your experiment, one has to consider ligand immobilization strategies, optimize Analyte interactions to good kinetic analysis, mass transport and rebinding, and the data analysis is very important. And of course, at the end, we also have to prepare the data for communication. And so, what do we have to know before we start the experiment? We need the information about the interacting compounds, like the molecular weight, the PI, and we will see in a moment why we need each of them, but I can very shortly talk about it. The molecular weight is in order to know how much RU I can expect and what is the expected Rmax in our experiment. The PI is important in order to know what are the best pHs in order to bring down the ligand on the surface. Whether we use tags, because tags we can also use again to bring down and specifically bind our ligand to the surface. The concentration is important because the concentration relates to the Analyte. What concentrations do we need to use, and of course also to the ligand, what concentration to use in order to get the right Rmax, what buffer, pH, salt, additives, and this is important also to keep our protein and other material stable and in good soluble condition, but also for the binding, sample purity. Sample purity isn't always that important. A nice feature of SPR is that it will work also when the samples are not really pure as long as I know the concentrations. Binding observed with other methods is good to have in order to compare, but of course this is something that one doesn't always have, but at least it gives a comparison. Which kind of interactions do one expects to get? Is it a 1-to-1, 2-to-2, whatever? What is the model of interaction? Which of the molecules should be the ligand and which should be the Analyte? Because if we have two molecules or more, one always can be ligand and one Analyte. How to immobilize our ligand, how to look at our analyte binding to the ligand, and this depends on the flow rate, time, concentration, access of non-specific, assess the non-specific binding, which is always a problem, and we will see it in examples. Are there any specific regeneration conditions? And this is something which is of big importance because we don't want only to flow into one. So we want to use our surface over and over again. And in order to be able to do it, we have to regenerate. And while we do the regeneration, we really do not want to destroy our chip. So we want to be able to do good generation, which cleaves the analyte from the ligand, but still we will see. And then positive and negative controls in order to know that what we see is indeed what we wanted to see and not some artifacts. Okay, now what is the relation between ligand and analyte, and what is the importance of Rmax? So we talked briefly about Rmax, and Rmax is basically the maximum binding that one can achieve with the analyte that flows on a chip on which already I did immobilize the ligand. So I first immobilize the ligand, then the chip is ready, and then I want to see what is the theoretical limit of binding ligand, and this is the RA. Now, the Rmax is the maximum theoretical response of analyte for a given ligand level. Now, for this, what we have is the stoichiometric number of analyte-ligand interactions. So let's say if it's 1, then the n will be 1. So 1 analyte, 1 binds 1 ligand. And then what we have is the analyte molecular weight and the ligand molecular weight. And then we have the surface density of the ligand. So basically what we have, it's a very simple equation. From this simple equation, from the ratio between the molecular weight of the analyte and of the ligand and of how much ligand is bound, one gets the theoretical limit for binding of the analyte. Now, of course, this is the theoretical limit, and this theoretical limit assumes that all the ligand is active in binding analyte, which is never true. And then the only question is, what is the percentage of active ligand? And this can be up to 90% in very optimal conditions, but it can also be 10%. So the golden rule, in order to get good, reliable data, we do not want a high Rmax, because when we have high Rmax, and we'll talk about it later, we get artifacts such as rebinding conditions. So we would like to have an Rmax of about 200 RU. And then we can kind of calculate what would be the ligand density to build this Rmax. So assuming that our analyte is a small molecule, which a molecular weight of about 1,000. And our ligand will have a molecular weight of 10,000. And in this case, we need to bind 2,000 RU, and it's a one-to-one stoichiometry. And in this case, we have to bind 2,000 RU of the ligand in order to get 200 RU of the analyte. But as I say, this is theoretically, because very often we will get not 100%, or never will get 100%, but we get anywhere between 10 and 90% of active ligand. So once we know this, we know how our chip works, then we know how much to put in ligand, and in this case, the guess would be anywhere between 3,000 and 6,000 RU of ligand, and this, as I said, really depends on the way of binding. Usually the covalent coupling, anion coupling, has a lower efficiency. It means that more of the ligand will be inactive, while specific bindings through tags will have a higher efficiency of activity. So which molecule should be the ligand and which should be the analyte? And this really depends on purity, on the tags that you have, on the non-specific binding, and what do we really want to sample. So for example, if I have one target and I want to have now 30 new drugs or molecules that I want to evaluate against, then it would be of a big advantage to have this one target or 5 targets, let's say, on the surface, because on the same surface I can flow now, using the robotic automation, I can flow a very large number of analytes, and analyze them. So I will take the ligand in this case, the one where I is the lower number. But of course, it depends very much on where the capturing works better. So we talked about different conditions, and we should confirm the ligand activity once we bind it, if we can, using our control analysis. So if I'm searching for some new analyte, let's say new drug to bind, if I have a control that I know that binds, it's always of a big advantage, because I know that my surface is okay. That with the control, the surface is working okay. Of course, if I don't have it, I don't have it, and then I have to rely on it that my surface is okay. And this is always a disadvantage if you don't know that your surface is okay. So, for example, if I'm looking for an inhibitor, for a new small molecule inhibitor to a certain ligand, it would be nice if I could bind something to this ligand, some other protein or something else that I had, in order just to verify the activity of my surface, because then I know what to expect out of my surface. And now we can see the different ways of coupling. So the most common coupling method is using amine coupling. This is universal. This can be done with any protein. And it's basically the amine coupling of the lysine of the N-terminals of the protein that will bind to the activated surface. And an alternative to this would be biotinylation, and this is to some extent an alternative. Why? Because the biotinylation, what we do, we usually do biotinylation also on an amine, on a free amine, so in this sense it's the same. We are doing it randomly on any free amine, but instead of capturing through amine coupling to the surface, we take a streptavidin surface and we can buy a chip that has already streptavidin in the body. So in this sense, also in amine coupling and also by biotinylation, we get the same kind of random orientation of the protein towards the surface. So the random orientation, as you can see here, can be that the active site will bind the surface, and then we won't get any binding as we want, but it can be also any other conformation. The advantage really of having biotinylation over standard amine coupling is that amine coupling needs a low pH in order to bring the protein down to the surface. And very often, many proteins don't like this too much, this low pH. And then the disadvantage is that the percentage of active ligand on the surface is lower. So personally, today I'm using, if I want to do amine coupling, I use most of the time biotinylation of the protein through amine coupling, which is a simple procedure for which one doesn't have to lower the pH of the protein, because biotinylation is done with many kits available in standard pH, and then I bind it to a streptavidin surface, and this way protect the protein better. And usually the percentage of active ligand is better than just with random amine coupling to the surface. Of course, one can do also thyroid binding and others. And as I said, the disadvantage here is the total heterogeneity and the percentage of inactive versus active ligand. Another way is through specific tags. And for example, and one specific tag which is most prominent is a histag. Histag is very much used. And this way one can bind, if the histag, let's say, on the N-terminus, and always the N-terminus will bind the surface. And quite recently, Bio-Rad came out with a new surface, with a new histidine surface, and it binds very well proteins that have histag on it. There are many advantages to this. It's also the conformation of the protein, which is the same. It's also the possibility to regenerate the surface, so one can actually bind a new ligand on the surface by regenerating the whole surface. And the efficiency is also really very high. And then one has other possibilities, so one can bind through antibodies to the surface, and one can build these, I would say, sandwiches. So one can bind the antibody to a surface, let's say by anion coupling, and antibody binding to surfaces is very efficient, and then one can capture the protein that one wants using the specific antibody against this protein. One of the advantages of doing this is that one really doesn't have to purify the protein too much in advance, because, and that's the same with a histag surface, because when one will flow also quite dirty protein as ligand in this case, and the hist surface or the antibody surface now will partially purify the ligand surface, and this way one can skip quite a lot of the purification of the ligand and get much faster to do the experiments. So these are two experiments, and here we can see with histag, the binding with the histag, and here we can see a GLC. And what was done here, protein A was coupled to the surface, and the antibody was bound to was the Analyte in this case. So human IgG was Analyte. So the protein A is the ligand, and the human IgG is the Analyte. And what you can see here is two cases and some kind of analysis of them. And you can see the ligand density in these cases. So in the histag chip it was 58, and in the GLC chip it was 101. You can see that the kinetic parameters are kind of quite the same, and also the KD is about a 50% difference, and also the Rmax is about the same. So really the difference is in the activity. In the histag chip you get a 32% of activity, and the activity is a fitted Rmax. The fitted Rmax versus the theoretical Rmax. While in the GLC coupled, in the amine coupled basically chip, you get 18% of activity, and so you can see that the tag gives a double as good activity than I get with the amine coupling. So in both cases, but just to tell you, the Rmax is too high. We said we should get an Rmax of about 200, and here you can see that the Rmax is about 350. So one can do this experiment with lower Rmax, and it will only benefit. We have an advantage in the proton that we have 6 surfaces. So you can utilize the 6 surfaces in order to optimize our binding conditions. And here's an example of binding conditions of IL-1 and IL-1 receptor. So what you can see here in the plot on the right side, you can see the ligand density versus the pH, and on the right side you see the Analyte Rmax. Okay. Now what we really are interested in is in the Rmax. So we want to get an optimized Rmax relative to the ligand density. It's not that we want the optimal ligand density, but we really want to optimize the Rmax relative to the ligand density, because this will tell us about the efficiency of getting active molecules of Analyte on the surface. So we can see here the ligand density, and this was done in different pHs. And but you can see that really the best Rmax we got in these conditions here, and these conditions here gives us a maximum of a pH 5.5. So this was done at a different pH. And also the binding of 2 analytes was here tried. One was an Analyte IL-1, and the other one was an Analyte which is IL-1 antagonist formation. So while the ligand density, while pH 5 gets the highest mobilization, you can see here, pH 5 gets the highest immobilization, then the best binding, not the ligand. So this tells us about the ligand. The blue one, you should look, the blue is the left axis, while the red is the right axis. So the highest ligand immobilization you got by by pH 5. But the best analyte, so the best efficiency of analyte, we actually got in pH 5.5. In other words, we want to use these conditions as pH 5.5, even though it seems that less ligand is bound, we get a higher efficiency. So knowing the analyte concentration is crucial, and it directly affects Ka and Kd. Dilute your analyte when running buffer to minimize by its effect, and short spin before injection. The online degazer is only for running buffer, and this is important. So what I'm doing very often, I'm also doing degazing of the analyte, and I do this in a degazer, and very often this has an advantage in getting a run that has no effect of bubbling, because this is something which is very destructive in any analyte run. And as I said, the degazer is really only for the buffer and not for the analyte. And one is using two separation bubbles and prepare 5 to 6 concentration and zero dilutions, and the dilution should cover the range of the Kd. In order to get what we want in our range is to get a Kd which is a dilution that is on both sides of the Kd. So for example, if our expected or estimated Kd is 10 nanomole, then if I have analyte in the range of 1 to 100 nanomole, then we are in a good condition in order to get a good binding curve, in order also to get good mass action binding. What is the concentration to need, and how long should we run it? Not too short and not too long, and not too high concentration. So here on the left side top, we see a too high concentration, because we see that even at the lowest concentration, we achieve are used at the end of the injection, because we don't run it all the way, because very often running it all the way will be very long and one gets more non-specific binding. So one wants to do a relatively short step of analyte binding and then dissociation, but one wants the right concentration to get good curvature, and this here is the right concentration, as you can see here in both cases, and also the right time frame. Here we see a little too long time, even so this is still okay, but one doesn't need to do such a long time. It may just introduce possible artifacts, and also it will use much more of the analyte. And this is a too short time, because what you can see here is that you still don't get any nice curvature in the line. So a time of analyte flowing is very important. Now we have the problem of mass transport and rebinding. And what is rebinding and what is mass transport? So when I run here the instrument, you can see that we see in this example that we just get a straight line. And this is very problematic for curve fitting. And what happens, what is mass transport, is that basically we don't have the analyte should be at the same concentration along the whole layer. So we have the gold layer, and on top of the gold layer we have the ligand bound. And we want to have the same analyte concentration like in the running buffer also in the layer. And if the analyte concentration is not the same, then we have a problem of mass transport, because then the analyte concentration that the ligand sees is actually too low. And this is something that we don't want. And we have a second effect which is called rebinding, and rebinding means that an analyte that is bound to a ligand will dissociate but will not go back to the flow, but will just jump to the next ligand. So if the ligand density is very high, then instead of having a random distribution of concentration, you get a high concentration near the surface, and then the analyte will unbind and bind to the next one, and this way you get a rebinding phenomena, which will make the dissociation rate to be seemingly slower than they really are. And this can all be related to the flow rate. So flow rate is very important, and this is quite an extreme example. It's really not always like it, but but we wanted to show you also an extreme example. And you can see here the flow rate, and the difference really here is the different flow rates. And you see here we have 6 flow rates from 25 to 200 microliter per minute. And you can see that the binding seems to get faster up to about 100 microliter per minute. And here in the Ka data, you can see that the 25 is 1.6 10 to the 4, and it goes up to 100 at about 3.2, and then it still keeps on crawling up slowly more. We will usually not use 200, but for Analyte binding, we may definitely consider to go up to 100 microliter per minute if we have a problem. And you can see also that the dissociation is also changing. Again, this relates to the mass transport and to the rebinding. And at the end, the overall affinity will change, but because the Ka and Kd go to opposite directions, the overall Kd actually is changing less than the kinetic rate constants. It is possible to take care of the mass transport also by fitting. There is a model which is called, in our curve fitting, which is called Ligand with mass transport. So instead of just Ligand with mass transport. And sometimes using this algorithm, one can get better fitting, taking care of the mass transport. And one can see here an example. So this is data of IL-2 and of OBC, and one can see it binds, and then one can see here the dissociation. You see that the fit isn't really good when one is doing the fit without mass transport. And the density, also note that RU here is very high. So we have here RU of 800 and estimated Rmax of about 1000. And this is definitely the surface is much too dense, and therefore we have here a problem or a possible problem of mass transport. So the real solution here would be to make this experiment with a much higher Rmax. But in this specific experiment, one can do also the fitting. Instead of doing the Ligand model, one can do a Ligand with mass transport, and you can see that the fitting parameters are really very different. And it's a tenfold difference in the fitting parameter of the Ka and also of the Kd and also of the affinity. Now, in both, and there's kind of a rule which says that if my RU per millisecond, so how fast it goes up, is not in the range of 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 9, then one may consider using Ligand with mass transport. Still, as you can see here, by the chi-square values in both fitting data is not really that good. So this experiment is problematic also when we do the curve fitting of Ligand with mass transfer. Let me talk now a moment about reference subtraction. Reference, we have 2 kinds of reference, and the references are very important because the references take away the bias effect, which is a difference in the refractive index between running buffer and Analyte solution that generates a signal. It should take away the non-specific binding and also the baseline drift. And we have 2 kinds of references. One is single and one is double referencing. And also in the single referencing, we can use an empty channel, or we can use what's called in the Bio-Rad an Interspot, which is between the spots. So first of all, we run the ligand, and then we can have either an empty channel or what we call here Interspot, which is the area between, because now when we run the Analyte, we see that these interspots never saw ligand. So instead of subtracting the empty channel, we can subtract the interspot. Of course, the interspots don't have any ligand bound on them. So if we want to bind as our reference a non-specific ligand and not an empty channel, then of course it will not cover it. But if we just have an empty channel, then the interspots will really completely cover the subtraction there. So you see here, we have the signal, and we have the empty channel and the interspot, and we do a subtraction in order to get the net signal out of it. So the advantage of Interspot referencing is to allow all 36 spots in the Bio-Rad to be used, because if you use the channel, then we have maximum of 30, and this is in case what you see here is binding of IL-2 with an IL-2 antibody. So we see here reference, Interspot reference, the channel reference, and you see that, let's say, Ka values are very close, about 30% difference between the two. Sorry, this is the Ka, this is the Kd, and you see here that the Ka values are less than 10% difference, and also the Kd is very similar, and also the affinity of the Interspot and channel reference is very similar. Again, this depends on the experiment, but indeed, very often the Interspot is enough. So when there's no specific binding of the analyte to the chip surface, empty untreated channels are good, or Interspots are good. But if we have a problem, then very often we may want to use a non-specific ligand, so a non-specific ligand which is irrelevant and will not bind specifically our analyte, and then we can cover an empty surface with a non-specific ligand in order for the subtraction. And now we have the double referencing, and the double referencing is unique to the proton and enables accurate, reliable double referencing with no need to perform separate blank injection. Now, how does it work? Again, we have the ligand and we have the analyte, and then we also have a run of the buffer. So, as we talked before, we have an empty channel on the ligand side. Now we use 5 concentrations and an empty buffer run on the analyte side. So we have now 5 concentrations of analyte and at 6, and we have an empty buffer run. And what you see here, that if we have a problem, because let's say we immobilized our ligand and our ligand has a drift, so the whole instrument has a drift, which happens, and this could happen because the ligand is cleaved slowly, it could happen because of other reasons, but this is something that definitely can happen. So now our double referencing also has the same kind of drift in it when we run the buffer and not a specific analyte. So now in double referencing, what will happen, we will basically remove this kind of drift and problems, and we get the net signal, and you can see it in the next slide in reality. So you see here, this is the run, and this here is the empty run, and now after using the channel, the buffer channel here, we basically correct the drift problem that you have seen before, and now you get a very nice curve that is much easier for fitting after the double referencing. So what we have consider now, let's talk about publication. We have to know the sample information, of course, experimental conditions, so something we should know. We have to know the analysis, how we do it, and to get nice figures. And there's additional data available that you can read about in publication. What kind of kinetic models for the analysis? So the most common analysis, if it's a simple one-to-one, and most cases it is, then we start with the Ligand. We can use the Ligand to use drift, and this, if we talked about drift, so you have seen the drift here, so we can do double referencing, or we can fit this with the Ligand with drift, and then the Ligand with drift can take into account the drift, and we'll get the fit. It is better to have a double referencing, because as more free parameters we have, as more we may run into problems, especially if the association is very slow, because then in the fitting algorithm, it has to take into account a slow dissociation and a drift as well. And taking both of them into account may not produce as good data as to do it, but very often one is using also like more plus drift. Then one can use a mass transport model, as we talked about, and then we have more complex model like heterogeneous ligands or heterogeneous analytes. So one ligand binds to multiple analytes or opposite. We have trivalent analytes and two-state. So these are fitting models that are part of the instrument. So part of the package that you have is using one of these models. Now, how do we present our data? So, for example, this is the case of carbonic anhydrase as a ligand, and you see this is not sufficient information. This is basic. You see Ka, Kd, and affinity data, but you don't really know from this table here what do we have, how good are the data, and how good are they evaluated. So a more complete data, we have also the Rmax data and also the chi-square data, as you can see them here. So you see what was actually done in this case, each of the experiments had a different concentration of ligand, so the different RU of ligand. So you see L1 and A2 are quite similar, L3 has lower ligand, and L4 has even lower ligand, so about a third. And as a consequence of this, you can see that the Rmax get lower. And the lowest ligand, and because the Analyte here is very small, then the Analyte has an Rmax of under 10, and you can see this here. Still the data are not bad, so you can see by the chi-square it's almost 2, so the data are not bad, but to have somewhat a higher ligand has an advantage, and you can see that the chi-square gets somewhat higher, so it has an advantage. And you can also see that L1, L2, and L3 have about the same K-ohm and K-off data and affinity data, while L5 is somewhat not as good, and really the reason is that the Analyte is very low because the ligand concentration here in this case was also very low. So here you see the complete information, and you also can see how the ligand is affecting the overall outcome, which is overall not bad. So this is here a good example. What you can see, because what was done here, 3 times injection of the same Analyte over ligand, and you can see here the details of this. The density of the chip was 1,800 RU, and we have here an Analyte, and you can see that Rmax in this case is 83, and we said we don't want to be over 200, and 83 is very good because you can see that the data fit very nicely with the curve, and also that the chi-square value is very good, and that Ka and Kd data have relatively low, currently low errors, and the data fit is really good, and also it repeats itself. So the experiment was done 3 times independently, and the data really fit and overlay one another very well. So this is an example of a rather good experiment that's not perfect, and you can see it especially at the high concentration because you can start to see some denting, but because we do a global set analysis, we use all the concentrations to get one fit, it to some extent overcome this kind of a problem. Okay, so overview, let's summarize the talk here. So factors to consider when planning SPR experiments. We talk about ligand immobilization, ligand densities not more than 200 RU, coupling versus capturing, histidine antibody capturing, abidine strepabidine, analyze injection strategies, problems of mass transport and how to avoid mass transport by increasing the flow rate, and also having a relative not too high density, not too much RU, choose the correct referencing and analysis model, include those parameters in publications, and the additional resources here that you would like to consider.